Don't think finding out your spouse is cheating is always the worst part. Sometimes the worst part is realizing they've been slowly teaching you to doubt your own instincts. Today's story is about a husband who overheard one phone call, just one. There weren't any hotel receipts, no hidden photos, no messages, no confession, just a conversation he was never supposed to hear. And somehow, that single phone call destroyed a 20-year marriage. Hi everyone, I'm Hannah, and today's story comes from a husband who says he never actually caught his wife having a physical affair. Instead, he caught something that almost hurt even more, an emotional affair with their 10-year-old son's baseball coach. Before we jump in, I want you to keep one question in the back of your mind. How much flirting is just being friendly? And when does it become a betrayal? Because by the end of this story, that question might not seem so simple anymore. The original poster is a 47-year-old husband. His wife is also 47. They've been married for around 20 years. Together, they have a 10-year-old son who absolutely loves baseball. Like a lot of parents, they spent weekends driving to practices, cheering from the sidelines, and trusting the adults who were helping coach their child. One of those adults was their son's baseball coach. At first, he was just that, a coach, someone the family knew, someone the husband actually liked, someone he trusted. But looking back, the husband admits there were warning signs. His wife had always enjoyed attention from other men. She flirted. She touched men on the arm or the shoulder when she talked. Sometimes she'd send messages that felt just a little too friendly. There were even times when she lied about where she'd been. Nothing he could ever prove was a physical affair, but enough to make him uncomfortable. The problem was, he never really stood up for himself. Instead of drawing boundaries, he kept telling himself he was probably overreacting. He wanted to believe he was simply married to a very outgoing person, not someone who was being unfaithful. Later, he would admit something that really stuck with me. He said his biggest mistake wasn't ignoring the warning signs. It was being too embarrassed to talk to anyone about them. Not his friends, not his family, no one. Because if he had, someone might have looked him in the eye years earlier and told him, "This isn't normal." Then one morning, everything changed. He had a doctor's appointment. After it was over, instead of going straight to work, he decided to stop by the house first. It was a completely ordinary decision, one of those tiny moments that seems meaningless until it changes your life. He parked his car inside the garage. His wife didn't notice. He was home. He was upstairs in their bedroom when he heard the front door open. His wife had just gotten back. She was already on the phone, and the person on the other end was their son's baseball coach. At first, he wasn't trying to eavesdrop. He could only hear her side of the conversation. But then, something she said made him stop and listen, because it didn't sound like two friends talking. It sounded like something else. And the longer he listened, the worse it became. At first, the conversation sounded almost harmless. She complimented him. She thanked him for everything he did, for the kids. She laughed, a lot, more than you'd expect, for a casual conversation. Then, everything changed. He heard the coach ask her something. He couldn't hear the exact words, only her response. She laughed and said, "Don't start. I know where you're going with that." A few seconds later, she said something else. "I understand, but that's not something I can do." If the conversation had ended there, maybe he could have convinced himself. It was nothing, but it didn't. It kept going, and with every minute, she sounded less like a married woman, setting a boundary, and more like someone enjoying the attention. She laughed again and again. Then she said something that made his stomach drop. "If I wasn't married, it wouldn't even be an issue." She didn't stop there. She admitted that going out with him wouldn't be a bad experience, then quickly added, "But I can't. Not, I don't want to. Not, I love my husband. Not, please don't ask me again. Just, I can't." As the conversation continued, the coach kept pushing, and instead of ending it, she kept entertaining it. She told him, She was flattered. She admitted. She enjoyed the attention. She laughed every time he flirted with her. When he hinted that he wasn't giving up, she actually admired how persistent he was. At one point, she even joked that no man had ever been able to keep his hands off her. And when he claimed he could, she laughed even harder. The husband stood there, completely frozen. He wasn't listening to two friends talking anymore. He was listening to another man actively trying to start a relationship with his wife. And instead of shutting the door, she kept leaving it open, just enough to make him believe he still had a chance. Then came the part. He says he'll never forget. The coach asked what would have happened if she were single. She laughed again and answered that it would have been a whole different story. Not once during that entire conversation did she say, "I love my husband." Not once did she tell him to stop calling. Not once did she make it clear that this would never happen. Instead, she said something that would replay in her husband's mind over and over again. "I guess time will tell." Then she added, "Let's just enjoy being friends and see what happens." See what happens. Those 4 words hit him harder than almost anything else, because to him, that wasn't a rejection. It was a promise that the door was still open. And by the time the call ended, he already knew. His marriage would never feel the same again. When the call finally ended, he didn't know what to do. He hadn't planned to confront her. Honestly, he hadn't planned anything at all. He was still trying to process what he'd just heard. A few moments later, she walked upstairs. The second she saw him, he noticed it. Just for a split second, panic flashed across her face. Then it disappeared almost instantly. She smiled, said hello like nothing had happened, and even walked over to hug him. That reaction completely threw him off. He'd expected guilt, maybe fear, maybe an explanation. Instead, she acted like everything was perfectly normal. He panicked. The words he wanted to say just wouldn't come out. So instead, he lied. He told her he'd just been called away on an emergency business trip. As he packed a bag, she kept asking if he was upset. He told her he was only annoyed because he didn't want to travel. She believed him, or at least, she acted like she did. Then, he asked her to drive him to the airport. She agreed. The drive was almost silent, but he never intended to get on a plane. Before they reached the airport, he asked her to pull into the parking lot of a nearby shopping center. She looked confused. He took a deep breath, looked straight at her, and quietly said, "I want a divorce." She stared at him, then asked, "Why?" That's when everything he'd been holding inside finally exploded. Because of that phone call. For the next 2 hours, they sat there, going around in circles. She insisted she hadn't done anything wrong. Then, only minutes later, admitted maybe she should have stopped talking to the coach once their conversations became more personal. She said he was throwing her away like garbage. But she also admitted the coach had talked to her about his own relationships and about dating. Every answer seemed to contradict the one before it. Nothing made sense. Eventually, when she realized he wasn't changing his mind, she made one last request. She begged him not to end the marriage yet. She wanted couples counseling, one chance to fix everything. After everything he'd heard, he wasn't convinced, not even close. But after 20 years together, he agreed. Not because he believed the marriage could still be saved, but because he needed to know whether the woman he'd loved was willing to take responsibility for what she'd done. That night, he didn't go home. He checked into a hotel instead, and alone, for the first time. He admitted something to himself he'd never been willing to say out loud. I was weak. Not because his wife had betrayed him, but because, for years, he'd ignored behavior that should have never been acceptable. He kept hoping things would change instead of protecting his own boundaries. And now, he wasn't sure there was anything left to save. I think this was the moment the story stopped being about one phone call. Because sometimes a relationship doesn't fall apart in a single day. Sometimes it's years of ignored red flags that finally catch up all at once, and unfortunately for him, the counseling sessions were about to reveal something even more disturbing than the call itself. A few days later, they sat down for their very first couples counseling session. He wasn't expecting miracles, he just wanted the truth. He wanted to hear his wife acknowledge what had happened, because in his mind, there was no question anymore. The coach hadn't called just to chat. He'd called to ask out a married woman. The therapist asked a simple question. "Can you tell me what happened?" His wife answered first. She shrugged and said, "The coach asked me out. I said no, that's all." He couldn't believe what he was hearing. That's all? He'd spent days replaying that conversation over and over in his head. He knew exactly what he'd heard. So before the session, he'd done something most people probably wouldn't. He'd written down everything he could remember from that phone call, almost line by line. He reached into his folder, pulled out the notes, and started reading out loud. The room went quiet. His wife looked furious, not because he'd misquoted her, but because he'd brought the notes at all. She complained that nobody was giving her credit for saying no, but the therapist didn't see it that way. Instead, she turned to the wife and asked something that completely changed the direction of the session. "Can you honestly not see how this could feel like a betrayal to your husband?" His wife didn't answer. Instead, she became frustrated. She insisted the therapist wasn't seeing her side of the story. That's when the husband finally spoke. He explained why the phone call wasn't just an awkward conversation. It was the end result of something that had already been happening. He believed they were already having an emotional affair, because coaches don't usually call married women out of nowhere to ask them on dates, not unless a line has already been crossed. He pointed out everything that bothered him. She told another man she would have gone out with him if she weren't married. She admitted she enjoyed the attention. She told him to wait, because things might change. She laughed with him while he openly flirted with her. And perhaps what hurt him most wasn't what she said. It was what she never said. She never once said, "I love my husband." She never once said, "I don't want to hurt my family." She never once ended the conversation. Instead, she left the door wide open. When the session ended, they walked back to the car. Neither of them spoke. For several minutes, there was nothing but silence. He remembers thinking he would never go back home again. Then suddenly, his wife spoke quietly, almost hesitantly. She said, "I realize now that I betrayed you." He froze, because that wasn't what she'd been saying inside the therapist's office. It was the first time in 20 years that he could remember her admitting she'd done something wrong. For just a moment, he felt a tiny bit of hope, but that feeling didn't last very long, because the very next thing she said left him completely speechless. He turned to look at her. For the first time since all of this had started, she'd finally admitted that she'd betrayed him. He wanted to believe they were making progress, but then she asked him something that completely changed the way he saw her. She looked at him, completely serious, and said, "I needed someone else to tell me it was a betrayal." Then she asked, "How am I supposed to know when I'm doing something wrong?" He couldn't believe what he was hearing. This wasn't a teenager. This wasn't someone who didn't understand right from wrong. This was his wife, the woman he'd been married to for 20 years, the mother of their son. And she was asking how she was supposed to know that emotionally leading another man on was wrong. He sat there, trying to process it. Finally, he answered as simply as he could, "If it would embarrass our son, you probably shouldn't do it." She didn't really respond, and honestly, he wasn't even sure she understood. When they got home, his emotions were all over the place. On one hand, this was the first time she had ever admitted doing something wrong. On the other, It almost felt like she wasn't taking responsibility. It sounded less like remorse and more like someone who genuinely needed another person to explain basic boundaries. That thought terrified him, because if she honestly didn't know where the line was, how could he ever trust that she wouldn't cross it again? Then, something even stranger happened. Over the next few days, their physical relationship changed completely. He admitted they'd had more sex during those 3 days than they had in the previous 2 years combined. At first, he didn't know what to make of it. Was she trying to save the marriage? Did she suddenly realize what she was about to lose? Or was she simply afraid of the consequences? The more he thought about it, the less convinced he became that it was love. It felt like panic. And despite everything, he still couldn't shake one awful feeling. He didn't think his wife loved him anymore. In fact, he wasn't sure she truly cared about anyone except herself. That realization hurt even more than the phone call, because cheating can be a terrible decision, but living for years without empathy for the people closest to you, that's something else entirely. I have to admit, this is the point where I stopped asking whether she regretted what happened. Instead, I started wondering whether she actually understood why it was wrong in the first place. And unfortunately, the next counseling session would answer that question in a way he never expected. He wanted to believe. The first session had been a turning point. After all, she had finally admitted she'd betrayed him. Maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of real change. But the second session destroyed that hope. Almost immediately, this time, the therapist shifted the focus. Instead of talking about the phone call, she wanted to understand why. Why had his wife been so drawn to another man's attention? His wife didn't hesitate. She said her husband worked too much. She said he hadn't been giving her enough attention. She said she'd felt lonely for a long time. As she kept talking, the husband sat there, listening, not because he'd never heard those complaints before, but because something about them didn't add up. After the session ended, his wife seemed more confident than before, almost validated. Instead of reflecting on what she'd done, she started listing everything she believed was wrong with him. She said he'd become cold, emotionally distant, that he'd stopped showing her affection. He couldn't help shaking his head, because in his mind, the timeline was completely backwards. He hadn't pulled away for no reason. He'd stopped being affectionate when he first realized something was happening between her and the coach. That emotional distance wasn't the cause. It was the consequence. He reminded her of exactly that. He said, "I became distant after your relationship with him started." But she immediately shut it down. She insisted there had never been an emotional affair. Not now. Not ever. The conversation went nowhere. Again, for hours, they argued, round and round, the same points, the same denials, the same excuses. Every answer seemed to lead right back to the beginning. And slowly, something became painfully clear. He wasn't arguing with someone who was trying to rebuild trust. He was arguing with someone who still couldn't admit how much damage she'd actually caused. Around that same time, he started seeing his own therapist, not as a couple, just by himself. He needed someone to help him understand what had happened to him. The therapist listened to everything. The years of flirting, the lies, the constant attention she sought from other men, the emotional affair, the way she blamed him, the way she made him question his own reality. Then, the therapist said something he never expected to hear. "I think you're in an abusive relationship." He was stunned. The therapist went even further. He said he believed the husband was showing signs of PTSD, not from war, not from violence, but from years of emotional manipulation and living in a relationship where his own feelings had been repeatedly dismissed. The husband admitted He almost felt embarrassed hearing that. PTSD because of a marriage? It sounded ridiculous to him. But deep down, it also explained why he'd spent years questioning himself instead of trusting what he'd always known. That was the moment he finally stopped asking, "How do I save this marriage?" and started asking, "Should I even try?" By this point, he wasn't holding on because he believed the marriage could still be saved. He was holding on for one reason: their son. He admitted that if they didn't have a 10-year-old boy together, he would have walked away a long time ago. But every decision he made now had to go through one question: how will this affect my son? One of the hardest decisions he made was pulling his son out of baseball. His wife didn't agree. In fact, she broke down crying. Not because their marriage was falling apart, not because she'd betrayed his trust. She cried because she said she'd lost the joy of watching her son play. That reaction really stood out to him, because even then, she still didn't seem to understand why he'd made the decision. He told her as calmly as he could, "If our son keeps playing with that coach, our marriage is over. And if you ever speak to him again, we're done." For him, there wasn't any room for negotiation anymore. Friends online encouraged him to report the coach. Honestly, he agreed. The man deserved it. A grown adult trying to pursue a married woman whose child he was coaching. That crossed every professional boundary, but there was a problem. They lived in a small town. News traveled fast. If he reported the coach, everyone would know. Parents, teachers, neighbors. Eventually, his son would know too, or worse, his classmates would. He couldn't bear the thought of his son being whispered about all through middle school and high school because of choices made by two adults. So, for now, he stayed quiet. Not because the coach deserved protection, but because his son deserved peace. He'd also spoken with a divorce lawyer. Everything was ready: the paperwork, the plan. Whenever he decided to end the marriage, she was prepared to move forward. That gave him a strange sense of comfort. For the first time, he knew he wasn't trapped anymore. Leaving was finally an option. Still, he hadn't completely given up. Not yet. He told himself he would at least finish counseling. He owed that much to his son. Maybe, against all odds, something would change. But deep down, he already knew the truth. The chances of this marriage surviving were incredibly small, because in his eyes, real reconciliation starts with genuine remorse, and after everything, he still couldn't see it. Then he admitted something that, honestly, broke my heart a little. He said he'd expected one of two reactions: either she would fall apart, beg for forgiveness, and do everything possible to rebuild the marriage, or she'd simply tell him she wanted a divorce. Instead, he got neither. She minimized, she defended herself, she blamed him, she questioned why she had to change, and somehow that confusion hurt almost as much as the betrayal itself. But what haunted him most wasn't even what she'd done to him. It was what she'd done to their son. She had invited another man into the emotional space that belonged to her family, and she never seemed to grasp how dangerous that was, not just for a marriage, but for a child who looked up to both of them. By the end of his update, he wrote something that stayed with me. He said, "I think there's something psychologically wrong with her, not as an insult, not out of anger, but because after everything, he genuinely couldn't understand how someone could hurt so many people and still seem to feel so little remorse." And that's where we leave this story. Not with a dramatic ending, not with some perfect resolution, just a husband trying to decide whether a marriage that had lasted 20 years could survive without trust. As of his latest update, he'd already hired a lawyer. He was still going to counseling, mostly for the sake of his son. But deep down, he admitted he didn't believe his wife was ever going to change. Not because people can't change, but because real change usually starts with taking responsibility. And after everything, she still seemed more concerned with defending herself than understanding why she'd hurt him. I have to admit, this story stayed with me for a while. Not because of the flirting, not even because of the phone call, but because of how easy it became for one person to slowly convince another that their feelings didn't matter. When someone spends years telling you you're overreacting, you're too insecure, or that you're imagining things, you eventually stop trusting your own instincts. And I think that's exactly what happened to him. Thankfully, by the end of the story, he'd started listening to himself again, even if that meant accepting a future he never wanted. Now, I'd really love to hear what you think. Do you believe an emotional affair can be just as damaging as a physical one? And if you were in his position after everything that happened, would you have kept trying to save the marriage for your child? Or would you have walked away? The moment you heard that phone call, there isn't necessarily one right answer. So I genuinely love to hear your perspective. Leave a comment below, because I read as many of them as I can, and I always enjoy seeing how differently people view these stories. And if you enjoyed today's video, please consider leaving a like and subscribing if you'd like to hear more real Reddit stories like this. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.